Hi, and welcome back to the Craft Beer Corner. In today's show, we're going to be reviewing some sour beers. Sours really picking up steam in the market. IPA still the most popular craft beer style in America, but sours are really getting popular. They're really picking up steam. So we're going to be sampling 4 that are out now that you can buy today and see what they are all about. The very first beer we're going to review is the Crooked Thumb Brewing Grapefruit Florida Gose. This clocks in at 4.3% ABV. So let's go ahead and get this open and get this poured and see what this is about. You can see I already made a bad pour. I started sloshing too early, so it's going to get ahead, but I'll give that just a minute to settle. We'll go ahead and give this a sniff. Okay, it definitely smells like a classic Gose, really pungent, sour up front, and you can absolutely smell the grapefruit in there as well. So we'll see what this one has to offer. Hold this up, see if you can get a decent look at this. It looks very much like a classic Gose. It's a very light yellow, very pale, which is indicative of this style. So I'm going to go ahead. Yeah, it really smells nice. Smells very pungently sour. Let's give this a sniff and see what it's about. Okay, so very interesting on this one. The very first thing I get on sip is just a little tartness, a little sourness up front, but it's very mild. And then it actually has a rather long finish. It's still working. I can tell you the overarching flavor profile of this is not so much tart and sour, just that hit on the front. And then it really opens up and expands into a classic Gose flavor profile. Very biscuity, very dry. Biscuity and dry, and you get that kind of hints of hay, kind of toasty, crusty flavors that are in there. So this is very much a classic Gose, and there is just a tinge. I'm going to have another sip just to think about it. Yeah, just the smallest hint that comes in about the first 3 to 4 seconds. You get that little bit of brine, that saltiness of the water, which is the classic way that this style is brewed. It does have a little salt in there, and you can definitely taste it. But it balances very well, the sour to salt and then opening up into the classic flavor profiles. So far, I'm impressed with this one. Is it one of the best Goses I've ever had? No. Do I think it's better than average? Yes, I do. First time I've ever had this one, I'm very pleasantly surprised. We'll get the full ranking at the end, but for now, let's go ahead and move on to our next beer. Okay, so for our next beer, we're going to be sampling the Crooked Stave's Petite Sour Blueberry Wild Ale. Now, a wild ale is going to be brewed with naturally occurring wild yeast. It's rather named appropriately. That's exactly what it means. Tend to impart very, very sour flavors to beer. Now, there could be some different other complexities in here. It might have what some would refer to as barnyard or funk, or it could have even kind of like a gym room, a locker room with old gym towels and clothes and whatnot. But we'll see. All wild ales are different, and it really is dependent upon what yeast naturally just gets into batches they're brewing. So let's go ahead and get this poured in the glass. Oh, wow. I'm looking at this as I'm pouring it. It's beautiful. It's got a beautiful color. It's got a nice kind of pink tinge to it. Yeah, very nice pinkish hue. Oh, wow. Oh, wow. This smells exceptionally sour, exceptionally sour. The The bubbles on the head are formed pretty tightly, but they're moving out of the way, which is rather indicative of the style. So it's got a head like I'm looking for this. So let's go ahead and give this a sip and see what this is about. Okay, yeah, ooh, oh, yeah, that's really nice. Up front, you definitely get the blueberry and just a hint of sour and tart, and then the longer that it does its finish, the more sour and the more intense and tart that it gets. It's almost like drinking liquid blueberry sweet tarts. I'm gonna have another sip just to see here. Yeah, that's delicious. That's a seriously good beer right there. It's one of the better wild ales I've had. You know, it's always a crapshoot and a gamble when you're letting wild yeast strains come into the beer batch and do their thing. But this one's a home run. This is a real winner. Crooked Stave did a great job with this beer. This is exceptionally well balanced. It's got a wonderful flavor and it's very complex. You get a lot of the sweet, you get a lot of the acidity, you get a lot of the sour, but you can clearly taste the blueberry in there, and that's a really nice addition to this beer style. We'll get it a full review and get it scored at the very end. Let's go ahead and move on to our next beer. Okay, so for our next beer, we're going to sample the North Coast Brewing Tart Cherry Berliner Weisse. It clocks in at 4.1% ABV. And you can even see through the clear bottle, it's actually got a nice kind of pinkish orange hue to it. I'm sure it'll look even better poured in the glass, so let's go ahead and get that done. Oh yeah, yeah, it's a lovely looking beer. Kind of a rose color. So those cherries, I'm sure, will be imparting flavor and aroma as well as a beautiful color. Yeah, that looks nice. Just a hint of cherry on the nose. You can definitely smell the sour though. It'll be interesting to see just how tart and sour this is. Cherry is obviously might have the possibility to add some intangible tartness there into the mix on top of an already sour and tart style. So let's give it a sip. Ooh. Okay. So the cherry does actually come through pretty strongly on this one. Definitely get the cherry up front, get it in the middle, and you get it at the end. It's pretty delicate though. It's interesting. This does not remind me as much of a classic Berliner Weisse as any other I've ever had. In fact, I would say it reminds me a lot more of a cider. And that's not a bad thing in and of itself. Just if you're expecting a Berliner Weisse, this beer might throw you off. I'm not getting any of the dry, toasty, crusty notes. I'm going to have another sip just to really think on it here. Yeah, it's definitely good. You get tart and sour up front. Cherry comes through quite clearly, but it never dissipates and expands into any of the classic Berliner Weisse kind of check boxes that you would expect. All that dry, crusty, bready, kind of fresh baked goodness that you get in the finish, a long finish. It's just not here on this one. You get a lingering slight tartness, a little bit of acidity, but it's overwhelmingly cherry that kind of follows through from beginning, middle, and end. Head's almost fully dissipated. That's actually good for this style. It shouldn't have a big head at all that really lingers. So we'll come through and we'll give this a full rating at the end. Let's go ahead and move on to our final beer of the bunch today. Okay, so for the final beer we're going to sample today, it is the Anderson Valley Framboise Rose Gose. This is going to be very much like a lambic style, being that they have framboise in it, but since it's a Gose, I expect it to have a little bit of that salty back. So this could be a very interesting beer. Let's go ahead and get this cracked and poured in the glass, see what we're working with. And yes, it does come from a can. Never had a Framboise or a Gose from a can. Well, I've had a Gose, but not a Framboise. All right. In fact, our Crooked Thumb Grapefruit Florida Gose, I believe, was from a can and not from a bottle. Nonetheless, getting this poured. It's interesting. I would have expected this to have a much brighter red, pinkish hue, being that it's Framboise, which is raspberry. Very common flavoring for sour beers. Pairs very well. It's a naturally slightly sweet, slightly tart fruit, as the majority of you probably well know, but it does pair exceptionally well with sour style beers. Head already dissipating beautifully. It's got nice tight bubbles, but it should not really be forming a head, so it's doing its thing getting out of the way. Let's give it a sniff. Oh yeah, okay. Yeah, you really can get the raspberry right out of the gate. It just whacks you right in the nose, raspberry. But I can tell you, this actually does smell very briny. It smells, you can smell the salt water in there. So this ought to be a really interesting beer. Without further ado, let's go ahead and give this a sip and see what this is about. Oh, absolutely, yeah. Yeah, oh, wow. It's got a nice long finish. Give me a minute to think about it. Okay. This does not disappoint. The raspberry is not quite as intense as you might expect. It hits you up front. It certainly is very big on the nose, but it does dissipate to really big, bold, sour and tart, almost lactic in the nature of the intensity of the sour. But then it mellows out very quickly. It's not dissimilar to, you know, eating sour candy, if you had sour raspberry candy. Yeah, absolutely. Got a nice sour tart bite up front, and you get that raspberry very cleanly up front. Then it dissipates, and it opens up perfectly into a classic Gose profile. It's very dry. You get the classic toast, the bread, the biscuity flavors that just come through on the end. Has a dry, almost brute-like finish. But it's still got this very light, delicate raspberry that lingers all the way through, from the very front and the intensity of the sour all the way to the super clean classic Gose finish. And it is exceptionally well balanced. You do get the brininess, the little salt in the water that they use to brew as well. That much is crystal clear. This is a very good beer. This is well balanced. We'll go ahead and get all of our beers rated now and come back and see how they all stack up. Okay, now that we have sampled all 4 of our sours in this episode, let's go ahead and get them our rating. Our ratings are across 10 categories, 10 points possible, 0 the lowest, 100 the highest. So the very first beer we sampled was the Crooked Thumb Grapefruit Florida Gose. Again, that was a 4.3 ABV. For the aroma, it was really nice. You could smell the classic Gose scent when you took a big whiff, and the grapefruit really came through, so I gave that an 8 out of 10. The taste was good. It didn't knock my socks off, but it was definitely better than average. I gave that a 7. The body was really nice, almost perfect Gose. I gave that a 9 out of 10. The mouthfeel, very similar, but they can be different. The mouthfeel was also classic Gose. I gave that a 9. The finish was really nice. It had a nice long finish. And you got to really experience the full range that a Gose has to offer, from the sour and tart up front, and then opening into this dry, long finish that you get toast and bread and crust and all of that. It was delicious, and the grapefruit didn't really get lost in there. Got an 8 out of 10. The head and the retention, again, these are all going to be based on the style, so the head was not like you'd see in a stout, but that's what you want in a Gose. It stuck around a little longer, but I gave that an 8 out of 10. The appearance, it was a classic Gose, almost perfect, 9 out of 10. Balance, it was very well balanced. I would say above average. I've had better Goses. in terms of balance. I gave that a 7 out of 10. Now, the feeling in the intangible category. This is very subjective, just coming strictly from my own perspective. I'd say it's average. I gave it a 6 out of 10. You know, it didn't have that wow factor. It's a good beer, but it just didn't have the wow factor for me. As an example of the style, gave it a 7 out of 10. That's certainly above average. Grand total on this one, 78 out of 100 points. Moving on, the second beer was the Crooked Stave Brewing Petite Sour Blueberry Wild Ale at 5.5% ABV. This beer had a lot going for it. The aroma hit you big up front. You could smell the blueberry. You could smell the sour. I was really interested to see what I was going to get when I started to drink this beer. Gave it a 9 out of 10. Taste, this was a great beer. This was absolutely a great beer. This one is certainly the one that I personally enjoyed the best of the bunch. Easily the best sour I've had yet this year. Gave that a 9 out of 10. The body, for wild ale, you never know what you're going to get. I was kind of comparing to other sours. We could take Goses, we could take Framboise, we could take Saisons, farmhouse ales. It was kind of average, middle of the road. I expected it to be a little bigger. Gave that a 6 out of 10. The mouthfeel was great, though, on this one. It really had a mouthfeel you would expect in a sour beer. It was not too light, not too heavy. It had just enough that you could feel everything in your mouth. It wasn't viscous, but you could feel that it had depth to it. I gave that an 8 out of 10. The finish was great on this one. It was rather long, very complex, just layers of sour and tart and fruit and just intermingling with the malt blend. I gave that an 8 out of 10. Head retention, again, it did what it should for this style, 8 out of 10. The appearance, this was a beautiful beer. I gave this a perfect 10 out of 10. It was just a beautiful beer. It had this lovely pinkish, purplish hue to it. It was really nice looking in the glass. Balance, beautifully balanced beer. Nothing really overtook any other major player in it. All of the sour, all of the tart, all of the blueberry, all of that wild yeast that came to make this, it was all in almost near perfect harmony. I gave that a 9 out of 10. The feeling and intangible, 10 out of 10. I really enjoyed this beer. I highly recommend it. As an example of the style, I honestly am not sure I've ever had a wild ale I enjoyed as well as this one. I give it a 9 out of 10. That brings this to a grand score of 86 out of 100. This is exceptionally well above average. This is a beer I highly recommend seeking out if you can get your hands on it. The third beer we have here, the North Coast Brewing Tart Cherry Berliner Weisse. That was 4.1% ABV. The aroma, you could get the cherries up front. You could tell it was going to be sour, but it wasn't super pronounced. I gave it a 6 out of 10. It's hovering on the high end of average. The taste, same thing. I've certainly had in inferior beers for the style. I've certainly had superior, but it's above average. I gave it a 7 out of 10. For the body, I gave it a 6. I don't want to say it was flat. That's not fair. It didn't have the depth of other Berliner Weisses I've had. You know, it's just somewhere in the middle. 6 out of 10. Same thing for the mouthfeel, 6 out of 10. They're very related, though they're not always going to be the same. The finish, this one let me down a little bit. Not that it didn't have a long finish. It's just it didn't have enough layers to really pique my interest. I was really expecting some classic Berliner Weisse. They're not dissimilar from a Gose or even a Saison, really, those sour and tart beers. They tend to open up and let you experience the full range of all the ingredients that went into the malt bill. This one just didn't. So I gave it a 6. The head and the retention was great for the style, 8 out of 10. The appearance, it was a lovely beer. A nice, beautiful pink hue. It was wonderful to look at in the glass. Really get your mouth watering before you even get to taste it. So I gave it a 9 out of 10 there. The balance, just average. Again, you got the cherries, and you got the cherries, and you got the cherries, and it just slowly dissipated. There wasn't that much in balance, and it didn't really let the Berliner Weisse characteristic come through in the beer, in my opinion. And it reminded me, as I said before when I was drinking it, it reminded me much more of a cider. Like if somebody had made a cherry cider, that's almost what I would expect. It wasn't bad. it was just average. And, you know, compared to the style, there's so many Berliner Weisse options out there. This just doesn't stack up. But I give it a 5 out of 10. Feeling intangibles I had while I experienced it, 6 out of 10 on the high end of average. You know, it was an interesting beer. But again, for a Berliner Weisse, I was expecting something a little more than what it brought to the table. Finally, as an example of the style, again, I gave that a 6 out of 10. That brings the grand score to 65. And then our final beer that we sampled was the Anderson Valley Framboise Rose Gose that clocked in at 4.2 ABV. This was a good beer, had a lot going for it. The aroma out of the gate, you could smell it was going to be sour up front, and you could smell the raspberries in there. 8 out of 10. Taste, again, 8 out of 10. It was wonderfully layered, and you could get everything you would expect in a Gose and a Framboise, all in there. 8 out of 10. Body, it was a little lacking for a Gose. And Goses, because of the brininess of the water, that salt in there, they tend to add a little extra body to it. This didn't quite hold up comparative to most Goses, but I said it was average. I gave it a 5 out of 10. I've certainly had lesser Goses. Mouthfeel was quite nice though. The brine that it did bring did really sing in your mouth. You could really feel it in there. I give that a 7 out of 10, above average. The finish on this beer was exceptional. It was very long. It was very complex. Not dissimilar to the Petite Sour Blueberry Wild Ale. It was just layer upon layer upon layer upon layer. The longer that it lingered, the more you had to think about. It was really great in that regard. 9 out of 10. Head and retention, much like the rest of these, 8 out of 10. It was very good for the style, above average. The appearance, this one I actually, as it billed itself as a Framboise Rose Gose, I expected it to have a much more bright pink hue, maybe even bordering on red. It didn't. Not to say it was unappealing looking beer, I just expected more. I gave that a 6 out of 10. The balance of this beer was great. The salt, the raspberry, the sour, the tart, it was beautifully balanced, very harmonious beer, 8 out of 10. Feelings and intangibles I had while experiencing this beer, 9 out of 10. I was really blown away. There were so many facets of it that I was trying to process at once, but as I was actually experiencing the beer, I really was impressed with it. Even though there were a few little things about it that I could have nitpicked, overall 9 out of 10. Really interesting beer. And finally, as an example of the style, 8 out of 10, easily above average. Really the only thing that let me down about this was I expected a little more of that Framboise character, and it just didn't deliver quite as heavily as I would have liked. Anyway, that's the rating on this one. Brings it up to a final score of 76 out of 100. So the Crooked Stave Petite Sour Blueberry Wild Ale was our highest rated beer of this sampling of sours. As always, I do appreciate you all stopping by. I hope you found this video informative and entertaining. And if you like what you saw, please consider liking and subscribing. And if you know anybody that would enjoy this content, feel free to send a link to them. We appreciate you joining us today. And as always, keep it beer, keep it craft. Cheers.